They told you Salem's fires died out with the last witch trial, that the hysteria faded with the noose. But that's a lie. In the year 1865, when the nation was drenched in the blood of civil war, an inn was quietly erected on the charred ground where women once screamed their last prayers. The locals called it the Sisters' Inn. By daylight, it was a place of rest for weary travelers. By night, it became a chamber where whispers never ceased, voices echoing from walls that should not remember, doors that locked themselves, and mirrors that showed faces of the condemned. And here's the truth you were never supposed to know. The Sisters' Inn was not just haunted, it was engineered. A structure of design, geometry, and ritual, created to harness the agony of the past and channel it into the minds of the living. Men entered those halls and left broken, muttering of dreams that were not theirs, hearing commands in voices that were never spoken aloud. This is not ghost story entertainment. This is architecture of control, a machine of psychological domination built under the guise of hospitality. What you're about to hear was never meant for public ears. The records were buried, the witnesses silenced, and the property later sealed off by institutional hands that understood its true power. But tonight I will take you inside, not just into the crumbling timber and faded wallpaper, but into the forbidden history of why this inn was built, who the sisters really were, and the elite hand that pulled the strings behind it all. Once you see the pattern, you will never unsee it. This isn't about Salem, it's about control. And once you hear this, you cannot go back. Do you want to know what kind of men left their fingerprints on the Sisters' Inn? Judges, pastors, generals. And those fingerprints never faded. They're still here, reaching for you. The question is, will you pull away, or let yourself be taken into the truth? Listen close. The sisters were not sisters by blood. They were a council. Women taken from the town when the trials ended. Survivors of accusation and ritual, each given a new name and a new purpose. They were trained in silence. Their grief was refined into a tool. Their nightmares were catalogued and fed into a pattern. The inn's founders hired them not to tend rooms, but to embody history, to be living conduits of the past. Imagine waking to the soft footfall of a woman who remembers the rope around another's neck. Her voice a thread that pulls memory from your bones. They learned to speak in the pauses between words, to arrange furniture so that memory would settle into a guest like dust. The architecture took their lessons and made them permanent. The builders drafted blueprints that looked like harmless rectangles on paper, but the lines hid intention. Hallways were bent just enough to misplace a man's sense of direction. Staircases doubled back so dreams would fold over themselves. Windows were set at angles that fragmented light into thin slashes, light that wakes a different part of the mind. The parlor hosted a fireplace whose hearth never fully warmed. Its crackle masked a frequency tuned to unsettle sleep. Mirrors were installed not to reflect you, but to catch the echo of someone else's grief and press it against your face. Each nail and joint was placed to amplify suggestion, to let the building speak in the language of nerves. There were routines, meals served at precise times, curtains drawn with ritual cadence, music played at a pitch that loosened the barriers between thought and image. A guest's confession, whispered over brandy, would be subtly echoed back by the house, phrased in a way that made the secret belong to the inn as much as the man who spoke it. The sisters learned to listen not only to stories, but to physiological responses, a hitch in breath, a dilation of the pupil, a micro-tremor that reveals guilt. They became technicians of compulsion, and above it all hovered a quiet fraternity of men who funded this enterprise. Men who understood leverage not as financial but spiritual. They wanted men unmade and remade, obedient in ways brute force could never achieve. You are being taught a method, not told a story. Pay attention to the mechanics, where control disguises itself as care. That is always the trick, to hide the harness in velvet. The inn promised refuge. It delivered a different covenant entirely, and the cost of that covenant was more than coin. It was the surrender of a man's interior geography. Keep listening. The inn's engine is older and larger than you think. Do you think the Civil War was fought only on muddy fields and shattered railways? No. A second war was waged in silence, inside places like the Sisters' Inn, where the real battle was not for territory, but for the minds of men. While soldiers bled for the Union or Confederacy, generals and financiers checked into that inn under the illusion of rest. What they received was recalibration. Their wills were bent, their loyalty shifted, their nightmares repurposed. They left with instructions, often unaware that those instructions had not come from their own thoughts. This was the quiet front of the war, the psychological theater, where men could be rewritten without knowing. The Sisters' Inn functioned as a sanctuary of exhaustion. Guests arrived drained from the chaos of battle or the corruption of politics, and the inn offered softness, warm meals, quiet rooms, and the gentle presence of the sisters themselves. But fatigue is a doorway. A tired man is suggestible, his defenses thin, and that is when the inn began its true work. Each corridor was laced with symbols, carvings half hidden in the woodwork, designs borrowed from ancient temples, shapes that tugged at the subconscious. These were not random decorations. They were sigils, designed to align a man's thoughts with the inn's intention. You walked through memory without knowing you had entered. Ritual, letters survive, private correspondence intercepted. Before they were buried in archives, men confessing that they left the inn with a clarity they could not explain, a sense of duty that felt alien yet irresistible. One colonel wrote that he dreamed of chains, yet woke with a hunger to enforce order. Another, a politician, claimed that the sisters prayed over him, but when he asked what words they spoke, he could not recall. He only remembered their eyes and the feeling of weight behind them. Within weeks, both men advanced policies that served the very families funding the inn. Coincidence? No. This was design. Understand this. Institutions have always required chambers like the Sisters' Inn, not prisons, not battlefields, but laboratories of obedience. Spaces where minds are molded like clay, softened with ritual, hardened with suggestion. This was not about ghosts. This was about governance through the invisible hand of fear, guilt, and suggestion. The inn was a lever, and the men who pushed it moved nations. And here's the dangerous truth. What began in that Salem inn was not sealed in history. That pattern survives. Its symbols copied into schools, its architecture echoed in courthouses, its rituals disguised as traditions. The inn was a prototype, and the prototype became policy. The records that survived are not neat histories. They are fragments, stained ledgers, and journals written in the margins of prayer books. But they reveal enough to sketch the outline of a conspiracy, one older than Salem, older than the colonies themselves. The Sisters' Inn was not the first experiment. It was simply the most perfected. Before it came monasteries where silence broke men's will. Before that, courts where guilt was manufactured. And before even that, temples where geometry and sound manipulated the faithful into submission. Salem was chosen because it was already soaked in fear. The soil was primed, and fear is the most fertile ground for control. The sisters themselves were carefully selected. They were neither saints nor witches, but something in between. Women broken by accusation, shamed by their community, then quietly recruited. Why women? Because they carried credibility in grief. A woman's tears disarmed suspicion. A woman's presence whispered comfort even as her silence embedded command. Male patrons entered believing they were superior, but superiority lowers guard. That was the trap. These sisters were not caretakers. They were instruments, and behind them stood patrons whose names rarely appeared on deeds or records. Old New England families, descendants of Puritan judges who once condemned women to the gallows. Their heirs understood the mistake of killing bodies. A body buried is a problem forgotten, but a mind redirected, that is a servant you never lose. The inn was their reversal of shame, their penance twisted into power. Instead of silencing women, they weaponized them. Instead of burning witches, they cultivated them into agents of psychological dominion. Picture it. A weary senator arrives, clutching his papers. He dines, he drinks, and as he sleeps, the building bends him. He wakes believing he has found new resolve, but the resolve is not his own. He leaves with a conviction to pass laws aligned with the inn's hidden counsel. Multiply this by dozens of men, officers, judges, financiers, and you understand, the inn was not an inn. It was a parliament disguised as hospitality, a parliament without votes, without debate, without dissent. And here's the most unsettling part. It worked. The post-war reconstruction that shaped America bore fingerprints of those who passed through its doors. Policies hardened, punishments intensified, and surveillance of the common man expanded. All of it justified under order. But what they called order was really conditioning, seated in a building that whispered through its walls. Now ask yourself, if an inn could do this in 1865, what can institutions do now with steel, electricity, and digital eyes? The blueprint was drawn in Salem. The empire built from it still breathes. Every structure has a heartbeat, though most men never notice. The Sisters' Inn was no exception. Its pulse was hidden in the rhythm of routine. The creak of the floorboards, the ticking of the grandfather clock, the distant tolling of the Salem church bell. These sounds were not incidental. They were orchestrated. Each carried timing meant to penetrate the mind, to fracture sleep, to pull men into cycles where their subconscious could be manipulated more easily than their waking thoughts. It was not haunting. It was programming. Consider the rooms. Each chamber was painted in muted tones that aged quickly, giving the impression of decay. Guests described feeling as if the walls themselves pressed closer the longer they stayed. Some swore the ceiling lowered at night, though measurements never changed. That sensation, compression, suffocation was deliberate. By inducing helplessness, the mind becomes pliant. When a man feels enclosed, he clings to any voice that offers direction. The sisters provided that voice, softly, through prayer, lullabies, or even silence that seemed to hum with presence. The journals of one traveler, later suppressed, record something chilling. He claimed the sisters never told him what to believe. They simply asked questions. Do you feel the weight of your decisions? Do you hear the echo of your father's voice? These were not casual inquiries. They were triggers designed to reframe guilt into obedience. By the time he left, he confessed he longed to return, not because he was free, but because the inn had convinced him he was safe only within its walls. That is the ultimate control, to create dependence. And this dependence was not personal, it was systemic. Each guest carried the inn's influence outward into courts, banks, and churches. Imagine invisible threads woven through a dozen powerful men, each tugging toward the same direction without ever realizing they had been tied. That is how hidden agendas spread, not through orders barked in the open, but through whispers planted deep enough to feel like one's own conscience. Understand this truth. Guilt and safety are the twin weapons of control. The Sisters' Inn wielded both with surgical precision, and the men who walked out carried those weapons into the nation's bloodstream. Every law passed with moral authority, every sermon steeped in shame, every institution demanding obedience. They all trace back to places like this, where men were conditioned in silence. And here is where your descent deepens. The patterns of that inn were not lost. They were copied. Modern architecture, education, even government halls carry echoes of Salem's experiment. The question is, do you recognize the walls closing in around you now? The danger of the Sisters' Inn was never its ghosts, but its precision. The entire building was a machine for the extraction and redirection of human will. You must understand, what happened there was not superstition. It was psychology decades ahead of its time. Long before Freud, before Pavlov, before the language of conditioning entered textbooks, Salem had already seen it weaponized. The inn was not haunted. It was a laboratory disguised as folklore. There are blueprints hidden in private collections, sketched not by ordinary builders, but by men who studied cathedrals, prisons, and ancient temples. These men understood resonance, the way sound can loosen memory, the way geometry can alter perception. The parlor ceiling was built to echo whispers into tones lower than the human ear could consciously register. Guests described feeling dread or guilt without knowing why. The corridors bent at angles that distorted depth, making men doubt their own senses. And in every room stood a mirror, not to show a reflection but to fragment it. One soldier wrote that he avoided his own face after 3 nights, convinced he was being watched through himself. The sisters were not hostesses. They were custodians of ritual. They moved with timing that followed cycles, the waxing and waning of the moon, the tides, and the calendar of forgotten holy days. Guests thought they were receiving hospitality. In truth, they were participating in ritualized choreography designed to break down the barrier between conscious and subconscious. They left the inn altered. Some reported dreams in which they signed contracts, handed over keys, or bent the knee to shadowed figures. These men would wake convinced it was just a dream. But soon after, they enacted decisions in waking life that mirrored those phantom agreements, and this is where the line between haunting and programming blurs. The inn didn't need spirits, it manufactured them in the mind. If a man believes he is haunted, he behaves as though bound. And if he behaves as though bound, the chain is as real as iron. This was the inn's genius. To make control invisible by convincing men they were prisoners of their own guilt, not of a system that engineered it. So when historians dismiss the Sisters' Inn as just another Salem ghost story, ask yourself, who benefits from that dismissal? Whose interest is served by keeping you laughing at ghosts rather than recognizing an early model of psychological warfare? The enemy is never where you are told to look. By the late 1800s, whispers of the Sisters' Inn began to leak beyond Salem. Travelers spoke in hushed tones of its uncanny atmosphere, of how men left changed, quieter, more obedient. Some rumors reached newspapers, though they were quickly ridiculed as old Puritan superstitions. But behind closed doors, government archivists and church officials moved swiftly to erase the trail. Entire court records vanished. Diaries were confiscated under the pretense of protecting reputations. Even the sisters themselves were relocated or absorbed into convents, their names erased, their identities rewritten. That's the pattern of suppression. Bury the source, ridicule the witness, and leave only folklore behind, but erasure itself is proof. Institutions don't waste energy hiding what has no power. They bury what threatens their monopoly on control. Why erase an inn unless that inn revealed a method too dangerous to remain visible? Why silence survivors unless their testimony unlocked a secret about governance itself? The very act of suppression is the fingerprint of guilt. Consider this. In 1873, a fire gutted much of the inn's west wing. Officially, it was an accident, a tipped lantern. But eyewitness accounts describe something else. Flames erupted too fast, leaping across beams that should have resisted, as if the fire had been seeded. Several sisters were reported missing after that night, and no bodies were recovered. Yet weeks later, men in high office began quoting scripture with identical phrasing, repeating exact lines about obedience and order, as though reciting from the same script. Coincidence, or the transfer of programming, dispersed into the wider body of the state? You must see the pattern. Salem's witch trials taught the elite that fear alone could not last. It burns too hot, too fast. The inn taught them refinement. Not the gallows, but suggestion. Not chains, but architecture. Not screaming mobs, but whispered confessions. This is the method that survived, smuggled out of a burning inn and absorbed into schools, prisons, asylums, even the design of your city halls. They buried the building but kept the blueprint, and here lies the most chilling truth. Erasure is never destruction. Erasure is transplantation. What they buried in Salem, they planted everywhere else. Look at the world around you. Your routines, your institutions, even your places of rest. Do they comfort you, or do they condition you? That is the question you must ask before we descend further, because the next revelations will not let you return unchanged. After the fire of 1873, the Sisters' Inn ceased to exist in wood and stone, but its spirit lived on in policy and design. The building was gone, but the method had been perfected, and those who funded it knew exactly where to transplant it. Universities, courthouses, asylums, schools. Anywhere minds were gathered in groups. The blueprint of the inn reappeared under a new mask. Think of the asylum, built in cold stone, with corridors that twisted into disorientation. Think of the classroom, with rows of desks aligned like pews, repetition drilled until obedience felt like safety. Think of the courthouse, where towering ceilings dwarf the individual, where you feel small, guilty, ready to surrender before a word is even spoken. None of this is accidental. These structures are inborn. They carry Salem's psychological machinery inside their architecture, and every man who walks through their doors walks into a theater of control. Look at the universities of the late 19th century. lecture halls designed with acoustics that amplify authority, leaving the student's voice swallowed, or prisons designed with panopticons, circular watchtowers where a single eye could observe all. That is the Sisters' Inn reborn, not haunting men with ghosts, but teaching them to police themselves, to doubt their own freedom, to submit before ever being commanded. The inn's pattern spread like veins across the body of the nation, invisible yet undeniable. And who funded this expansion? The same families. Men who traced their lineage to Puritan judges, who had once condemned witches, but now understood the true alchemy of power. They invested in schools, endowments, churches, political offices. Their fingerprints shaped the very pillars of society. Salem's soil had taught them something crucial. The public can forget a spectacle, but conditioning lasts generations. Far better to haunt a nation with routine than with rope. The inn's whispers became cultural dogma. Shame woven into sermons. Obedience cloaked as morality. Silence exalted as virtue. The individual diminished in the face of the collective. And always, the architecture reminding you, you are small, you are watched, you are owned. The ghost story was the cover. The machine of control was the reality, and here I will ask something of you. If you have followed me this far into the descent, type the phrase, "I see the pattern, I break the chain," twice in the comments. This is not just engagement, this is initiation. Words have power, and by speaking them, you signal that you are no longer just a listener. You are an awakener. Silence is a surveillance technology older than cameras. The Sisters' Inn taught its patrons that oversight need not be visible to be total. The methods perfected within its timbers were not limited to whisper and geometry. They became a philosophy of watching, an ethos exported into the public square. After the inn burned, its lessons traveled with the men who stayed there. Habits, phrases, routines that signaled information without seeming to take it. Patrons formed committees and advisory boards. Church elders folded questions into sermons. Schoolmasters learned how to grade character as well as scholarship. Small inquiries, where were you on that night? Or who do you keep company with? Were taught to be casual. But their purpose was exact, to map loyalties and debts. The inn taught not brute force but social calibration, turning communities into fine instruments of mutual oversight. Gossip became data. Confession became currency. Architectural choices reinforced the ethic. High windows that looked inward, galleries that allowed many to watch a single stage, and long corridors where footsteps echoed and invited scrutiny. Public spaces were arranged so dignity itself could be leveraged. The watched were made to feel honorable when they complied, disgraced when they did not. Surveillance did not need uniformed officers. It needed rituals that made watching feel polite and right. Administrative systems took the idea and institutionalized it. Records were kept not merely to account for property or tax, but to catalog associations, to flag the unstable or unreliable. Early reformers proposed registries of moral standing and attendance logs that tracked loyalty. Files were shared among patron families, unions, and boards, data used to steer careers and marriages, to whisper caution into ears that might otherwise speak freely. The point was not evidence for courts. It was leverage. Technology later accelerated these practices, but the core remained social. When institutions make observation ordinary, people police themselves. The Sisters' Inn gave America a blueprint for that interior watch. Use comfort to extract truth. Use routine to normalize oversight. Use architecture to make confession feel voluntary. This is the legacy you walk through today. The form shift, cameras, databases, apps, but the mechanism is the same. Watch for the rituals that ask you to disclose, the friendly interview, the obligatory seminar, the orientation that requests past mistakes. Those are the modern corridors of the inn. Recognize them, and you begin to unbind the old machinery. Do not comply silently. The deeper you descend, the clearer it becomes. Surveillance was only the surface. The true inheritance of the Sisters' Inn was not the watching of men, but the shaping of them. Surveillance gathers data. Conditioning installs commands. That was the real purpose of Salem's silent machine, to forge men who would enforce the very system that bound them, believing it was their own conviction. Think of the Reconstruction era. The country was fragile, bleeding, fractured. The men who passed through the inn, generals, lawmakers, financiers, emerged carrying seeds of an ideology that spread faster than fire, an ideology of order at any cost. Their dreams of chains, their visions of obedience, crystallized into laws that expanded punishment, broadened surveillance, and demanded conformity. Not from their enemies, but from their own people. The inn had written its philosophy into them, and they, in turn, wrote it into the nation. Look at the institutions born in that period: penitentiaries with strict regimens of silence, schools where punishment came not for violence but for speaking out of turn, churches where sermons drilled guilt into the marrow of men. These were not organic evolutions. They were replications. Replications of the inn's central lesson: the broken mind obeys longer than the beaten body. And here's the terrifying truth: they didn't need to keep building inns. They only needed to build systems that produced the same psychological pressure. You were told America was rebuilt on freedom. In reality, it was rebuilt on obedience, engineered obedience. The freed man was shackled by debt. The working man was shackled by wage. The believer was shackled by guilt. The child was shackled by the lesson that silence is virtue. And behind it all, the same families who once financed a quiet inn in Salem tightened their grip, ensuring that the machinery of control became the backbone of the republic. And this is why so much of history feels strangely hollow when you examine it. Why wars end but the chains never vanish. Why leaders change but the policies remain. Why liberty is promised but surveillance expands. It is not incompetence, it is continuity. The Sisters' Inn was the testing ground, and the world you live in is the perfected model. Now I must ask you directly, can you feel it? The walls of your own routines closing in, the architecture of your life bending your will. If you can feel it, you've already seen through the veil. But if you cannot, then the inn's descendants still have you exactly where they want you. Until now, we've spoken of the men who stayed at the Sisters' Inn and the structures they carried into the world. But what of the sisters themselves? Their story was not erased, it was weaponized. These women were not free agents. They were vessels, sculpted to serve, sacrificed in silence. And when the inn burned, their fate was more sinister than the official record admits. The archives whisper of relocations, but relocation was a polite word. Some sisters vanished into convents, where they lived out their days behind stone walls, their silence mistaken for piety. Others were absorbed into wealthy households as governesses, where their subtle methods of conditioning could be applied to the children of elites. A few, too dangerous to release, too broken to repurpose, simply disappeared. The truth? They were not killed. They were kept. Whispered references to the chambermaids of silence appear in correspondence between financiers and pastors, likely a coded reference to the sisters who survived, hidden and moved from place to place as tools of indoctrination. But their role was not merely domestic. Some became teachers in the first moral academies for girls, where silence, shame, and obedience were drilled into young minds with uncanny precision. Others were placed in hospitals for hysteria, where their presence was said to calm the patients. But calming was never the true purpose. They were observing, documenting, experimenting, continuing the inn's work under new roofs, refining methods of suggestion, confession, and guilt. Imagine the horror of their existence. Women who once bore witness to fire, rope, and accusation, trained to turn their trauma into instruments of control. Their grief was not healed. It was harvested, and it did not end with them. Many of these sisters left behind no bloodline, but they left legacies of influence. Their students, their wards, their patients, all carried fragments of the conditioning outward, like spores released into the air. This is why the Sisters' Inn never truly died. Because the sisters themselves were made into living extensions of it. They were the mobile architecture, the human mirrors, the whispering corridors hidden in plain sight. Wherever they walked, the inn walked with them. And so, when you hear whispers of hauntings in boarding schools, in convents, in asylums, understand, those were not hauntings. They were echoes of Salem, echoes of the women who learned to embody a system of invisible control. Their shadows have not left. They stand at the origin of a cycle that has reached even you. You must understand, ritual, religion, and governance were never meant to be separate. They are three faces of the same mask, and the Sisters' Inn was the stage where that mask was perfected. What looked like hospitality was ritual. What sounded like prayer was programming. What passed for governance was nothing more than obedience dressed in sacred robes. The sisters themselves were trained to blur these lines. Their lullabies borrowed from psalms. Their gestures mirrored liturgical rites. Their questions echoed catechisms, though twisted to probe deeper into guilt than any sermon dared. Guests thought they were receiving spiritual guidance. In reality, they were participants in a ritual designed to break them down, strip them of sovereignty, and rebuild them in the image of obedience. This was not religion for the soul. It was religion for the state. Now imagine the effect when this philosophy was carried beyond the inn. Churches hardened into institutions obsessed not with salvation, but with surveillance of morality. Schools became temples of routine, where bells replaced church bells, lessons replaced sermons, and shame replaced sin. Government halls adopted the same theatrical weight. Grand stairs, vaulted ceilings, echoes that reminded men of their smallness. Every institution learned to harness ritual, not to elevate the spirit, but to bind it. And here lies the forbidden truth. The same families who had once sat as Puritan judges were the very architects of this fusion. They realized that fear of hell could be redirected into fear of law, that obedience to God could be repurposed as obedience to state, and that rituals, whether kneeling in a pew, standing in a classroom, or rising in a courtroom, were interchangeable tools of governance. The inn was their laboratory, the sisters their technicians, and the nation their canvas. Ask yourself, why do institutions all feel the same? Why does walking into a church, a courthouse, or a school awaken the same unease, the hush, the demand for silence, the weight of unseen authority? It is because they were all built from the same prototype. The inn did not die, it metastasized. Its architecture of control became the architecture of your life. And the most dangerous part? You were trained not to notice, to call ritual tradition, to call programming discipline, to call governance order. The mask is seamless now, but once you see beneath it, you cannot unsee it. What you must understand now is this. The Sisters' Inn was never about the moment. It was about the lineage. Control, to be effective, must reach beyond one man's lifetime. It must stain the generations. That is the legacy they engineered. The sisters, trained in grief and silence, were deployed into households not merely as caretakers, but as seed planters. They shaped the sons of judges, the daughters of merchants, the heirs of generals. These children were raised not with freedom, but with carefully woven chains, rituals of shame, gestures of obedience, lessons of silence. It was subtle, invisible, but relentless. A son who felt his father's judgment in every mirror. A daughter who believed her worth was measured in silence. This was not parenting. It was programming. By the time these children became men of influence, the conditioning was no longer external. It was their identity. They didn't need to be coerced. They believed in obedience. They believed in order. They believed that silence was holy, that surveillance was moral, that submission was virtue. And so they carried the inn not in their memories but in their blood. This is why power feels eternal. Families rise, dynasties fall, but the psychology persists. Because once an idea is fused with identity, it replicates itself without effort. Fathers teach sons, mothers teach daughters. Entire bloodlines shaped by conditioning born in a crumbling inn on Salem soil. That is why the system never dies. It breeds itself into the next generation, silently, invisibly. Do you wonder why certain families never lose power? Why their wealth and influence seem untouchable? It is not just inheritance of money. It is inheritance of programming. They are raised inside walls of silence, bound to rituals that condition loyalty, groomed from infancy to continue the agenda. The rest of the population is conditioned as subjects. They are conditioned as rulers. Two different scripts, same machinery, and you, yes, you, are not untouched. Because the patterns seeped outward. Into schools you attended, into sermons you heard, into the shame you felt as a boy when you questioned, when you disobeyed, when you dared to speak. The inn touched you, though you never stepped inside it. This is generational warfare. Not fought with guns, but with guilt. Not won with armies, but with architecture of thought. And unless you see it, you are bound by it. The American dream. You are told it was built on freedom, on opportunity, on the sweat of the individual carving his destiny from stone. But that was the lie. The dream was engineered as a cage, polished until it looked like gold. And the Sisters' Inn was one of the forges where its blueprint was hammered into flesh. Think about it. What is the dream? Work until you break. Obey without questioning. Aspire to the house, the land, the family name, all while submitting to systems of law, money, and morality you never created. You were told this dream was your inheritance, but it was never yours. It was theirs. A cycle of labor and silence, obedience and shame, passed down through generations. The chains were hidden inside aspiration itself. The sisters' legacy was not only in broken children, but in an architecture of thought that reshaped society. Their methods of indoctrination, whispers of guilt, rituals of control, silence as currency, were absorbed into schools, courts, churches, even businesses. The inn's psychology became the nation's skeleton. A boy drilled into silence at the table grows into a man drilled into silence at the factory. A girl taught her worth is in her obedience grows into a wife who never questions her husband, and sons who never question their rulers. This is why the dream feels hollow when you touch it. Because it was designed that way. It was not built to free you. It was built to harness you. A field where men are harvested like crops. Where the few who hold the ancestral codes, the families conditioned to rule, feed on the labor, the silence and the obedience of the many. And when you fail, when you break under the weight of the dream, what do they tell you? That it was your fault. That you did not work hard enough. That you did not obey well enough. Shame is the invisible whip. Guilt is the invisible chain. The dream is not your inheritance, it is your leash. But once you see it, once you pierce the illusion, the chain begins to crack. You are no longer the obedient child at their table. You become the man who flips the table over. The dream was not yours to begin with. So why would you die defending it? The inn may have rotted into dust, but its methods mutated, sharpened, and spread like a virus. What was once whispered in candlelit rooms is now broadcast in glowing screens. What was once etched into the minds of a few bloodlines is now embedded into the minds of millions. The control did not die, it evolved. Today, the voices of the sisters do not come from lips, they come from institutions. Schools where obedience is graded, not curiosity. Workplaces where silence is rewarded, not innovation. Media that punishes questioning, but praises submission. Do you see it? The ritual never ended. It simply dressed itself in new robes, and the most sinister trick of all. They made you think it was you. They no longer had to beat you into silence, because the conditioning was internalized. That inner voice that says, don't speak, don't resist, don't risk, that voice is not your own. It is theirs. A program running invisibly, generation after generation. This is why men live lives of quiet despair. They sense the weight, but they cannot name the hand pressing it down. They think it is personal weakness, when in truth it is systemic conditioning. They blame themselves for not achieving the dream, when in reality the dream was designed to break them. The inn has become the mind. But here is the dangerous truth. Once you recognize that voice, once you call it out, it loses its power. The moment you stop confusing obedience for virtue, silence for strength, guilt for morality, you begin to sever the program. That is why this knowledge is forbidden. Because a man who breaks the program cannot be used. He cannot be harvested. He cannot be controlled. That is why I told you earlier, comment the phrase twice to lock it into yourself. The chains are not mine. Write it below, not as a ritual for me, but as a declaration for you. Mark yourself as the man who sees, not the child who obeys. It is more than engagement. It is rebellion. This is the final descent, brother. The forbidden knowledge has brought you here, to the threshold. In the last chamber, I will show you the truth they never wanted revealed. The final secret of the inn, and why some believe its chains still tighten around men today. There is one last truth, buried deeper than the bones in the cellar, darker than the whispers in the rafters. It is the secret of continuity, because power, once forged, does not dissolve. It adapts. The inn was never just a building. It was a prototype, a laboratory where silence, shame, and obedience were tested, perfected, and encoded into bloodlines. When the walls collapsed, the sisters vanished into shadow. Some married into families of influence. Others disappeared into institutions, schools, churches, hospitals, where their methods could be replicated on a massive scale. And some say the most devoted among them carried the inn forward, not in wood and stone, but in ritual. Hidden gatherings, silent rooms, oaths whispered in languages older than Salem itself. This is why strange echoes remain, reports of men in power who all display the same cold detachment, the same preference for silence over speech, control over freedom. Families that rise from nowhere, suddenly untouchable, their children molded in secrecy. And always, always, the same shadow behind it, the echo of the sisters' design. You may think this is myth, that Salem's soil was stained by hysteria and nothing more. But look closer. Trace the bloodlines of judges, bankers, politicians. Follow the patterns of obedience demanded in schools, silence demanded in marriages, loyalty demanded in nations. The inn is still here. It never left. Its walls have simply become invisible, stretched across an entire society. That is the danger of forbidden knowledge. It does not free you, it confronts you. Because once you see the structure, you must decide. Will you remain inside the walls, playing the obedient role? Or will you step outside and embrace the burden of awareness? The inn whispers still. Not through sisters in black dresses, but through the inner voice of every man conditioned to kneel when he was meant to stand. The system is alive because you breathe life into it. But when you withdraw, when you refuse to carry shame as your inheritance, when you speak where silence was demanded, the inn collapses again. This is not history. This is present. And the choice is yours. Inherit their silence, or burn their house of obedience to the ground. Now you know what you were never meant to hear.